So I'm guessing that everyone has got a very, you're Danish, you speak English better than we do, no? We have a little sign in the economics classroom, which is a very much a multilingual classroom, that L for language tells me that I'm going too fast, or I'm using a vocabulary that is not familiar. So please do use that sign to, don't tell me at the end I understood nothing. Do that at the beginning. So those of you who've got an ear for accents will hear that I'm Irish. So I'm delighted to be leading the reverse invasion of Denmark. I don't know, I've got an ambiguous relationship with the field of economics. So when I was working in Africa, my business card said socioeconomist, and I was often referred to as an economist, but I've got I really don't self-identify as an economist. And I think that is because economics is a very mean, introverted, siloed discipline that refuses to look outside and be in conversation with the other faculties. And particularly around like the core assumptions of who we are as a species, that to make the economics model work, the modeling work, there is this story of this fictional character called Homo economicus who is mean, who is driven by greed, who is an individualist, who is totally rational, who is not influenced by the wider society in which they're embedded. And as a result of this story, studies in psychology have demonstrated that economic students are among the meanest, least generous in the faculty, that already when they arrive they're the meanest, and by the time they leave the gulf has widened. And this is precisely because of the stories that we tell. The stories that we tell deeply influence who we become as individuals, as communities, as societies. And so I find myself much more drawn to literature around natural science, biology, psychology, anthropology, material that is looking at the human condition in a broader sense than just this market-based, transactional, selfish, utility maximizing, totally rational individual who is the fictional central character in the drama of economics as told in conventional faculty. And I think that the story is told in such a mystifying specialist language as to alienate anyone who may even be attracted to the subject. And so my own experience in teaching what has been called economics, I'm not sure it's the right word, but in teaching the material that's been called economics for the last 20 years, I find that at the beginning there's a lot of fear, a lot of contraction, a lot of alienation from the subject, and by the end of the first day people are saying, oh, so that's what you're talking about. This is simply a philosophical inquiry into how we can live well as a human family within the planetary boundaries. And this is not primarily an exercise in mathematics. It's an exercise in intelligent philosophical thinking. So, I think it's important to say that at the beginning. So, I mean, if anyone who's sort of noticing they're still holding their breath because the word economics is in the title, release your breath. There's going to be no formulas, no mathematics. There's rather going to be, so I consider myself really, truly to be a generalist, a systems thinker. And so really what I will be hoping to do tonight is certainly not provide you with answers, because honestly, at the minute, we don't have them. But to throw up some areas that I think we can look to with a certain degree of fascination as being the source of potential solutions, ways of skillfully addressing the challenges we face. Maybe just one more comment by way of introduction is that I think until 2 or 3 years ago, when I was giving presentations in economics, it was a lot of it was about economic modeling and ideas and how, at a macro level, how we can. So the biggest problem we simply have at the moment, the biggest single problem, is a fixation with growth, an assumption that growth translates into well-being, and a recognition that we've created an economy that if we try to stop it, it's like a bicycle, it simply falls over and it's very messy indeed. Employment goes up, indebtedness goes up, social unrest goes up. So I think what I would have done in a talk like this even 2 or 3 years ago would have been looking at the design of the bicycle and looking at where are the critical design features of the bicycle that need to be changed, that enable us, if we so choose, to contract. Because I would have worked on the assumption that we have enough time to do that. And honestly, I no longer believe that to be true. That the reports coming in from the IPCC, from the Living Planet reports, like those who have said that actually we are on an exponential curve and that already tipping points are being activated, seem to have argument on their side. So I'm not going to do what I would have done 2 years ago. In fact, I'm going to begin by saying, I really don't know. We're in such a mess that I do not know what a way out is. And certainly at the macroeconomic level, believing that we have enough time, even if the political will were there, which it's not, to actually change the levers so that we incentivize an economy that is capable of contracting, I just don't think there's enough time. So I'm looking at levels that it seems to me the nation state and multinational bodies, transnational bodies, are so compromised and so deeply in the pocket of the corporations that it's not there that I'm looking. And so what I want to do this evening, I think there are parts of the map where we can look to for inspirational ideas. And the one that I'm going to propose tonight, it's only one. There are a number of other areas. I mean, I think Ross and I have also, and many other people I know in the room, have looked at community resilience building at a local level, which is a critical part of the equation. I'm going to look at a meso level, at the level, so the title of the talk this evening was The New Municipalism. And it seems to me that as I scan for experiences around the world that can offer some hope and look and provide a pathway, a possible pathway that might enable us to break the gravitational pull of the globalized economy, I think it's at the level of the municipality. And I really want to throw out these ideas as a provocation and hoping to have a really good conversation afterwards in terms of how this might play out in the Danish context. So I want to begin the journey. I'm going to look at a number of different case studies illustrating the potential power of the municipality to have a different agenda and to be less prone to co-option by the corporations. And the first point of call is in a region that's called the Third Italy, Emilia-Romagna, where something extraordinary happened in the 1970s. I mean, really, this is a momentous moment in the history of economic thinking and practice. That at the time economists were. I mean, it's strange to me that actually this isn't a better known story, because it's a critical part of the emergence into a qualitatively different type of capitalism. So from the advent of Henry Ford's production lines in the 1920s right up until the 1970s, it was almost like an economist's creed, like a total belief system. It was like the law of gravity, was that economies of scale beat all other means of organization. And reports started coming back from this region in Italy that actually the local economy was dominated by small-scale family firms and cooperatives, the great majority of which were under 50 people, that were out-competing corporations, not just nationally, but internationally. And at the time, I was working in the Institute of Development Studies in Brighton, which is one of the research centres that was exploring this phenomenon. There was a general feeling of disbelief in the economics profession. Like, the general interpretation was, they've collected the wrong data. You know, this simply cannot be true. It's like the law of gravity being contradicted. So what happened was, when they looked a little more closely, was they found that this phenomenon of the emergence of enterprise clusters, so whole ecosystems of small and medium enterprises working collectively to create an ecosystem of enterprises that was able to respond much more flexibly than the production line model. This was at a period, we were moving into the 60s and 70s, where we were moving away from mass markets for single products into much more diverse, fragmented markets in fashion, for example, in arts and crafts, many in shoes and fashion. And what they were discovering was that whereas the production line model was able to produce efficiently 1 million items of, say, 5 different products, that actually the ecosystem of small enterprises in Emilia-Romagna was able to respond much more flexibly. They had much less specialized, more general skills and technology, and they were able to respond much more flexibly to a growing range of different orders that were coming in. This making sense?
Yes.
Good. So I just want to check in that the language is, the accent is not too heavy, the language is not too fast. Anybody struggling?
He's nice.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So, fascinating. And so maybe just a little bit more on this region. In common with the Basque countries, the two great exemplars of a different way of social economic organization was the clusters in Emilia-Romagna and the cooperatives in the Basque country in Spain, the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque country in Spain. Both of which, in different forms, were manifestations of multiple hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of, in the case of Emilia-Romagna, small enterprises. In the case of Mondragon, the cooperative network in the Basque country, in the region of 250 cooperating, so cooperatives in a network of solidarity and cooperation, building supply chains characterized by solidarity around ethics, shared ethics of the different actors within the system. So what these two areas had in common, this is the Basque country and Emilia-Romagna, was a very strong Euro-communist administrations following very strong roles played in the anti-fascist campaign. So very strong ideological and social and ethnic solidarity in these regions. Let me give you some data on Emilia-Romagna, just to give you an idea of the scale. This is not marginal. This is significant economic phenomenon. So in this region, small family or cooperative businesses account for 42% of the companies in the region. Over 90% of these employ less than 50 people. Only 3 have employees of more than 500 employees. Of Italy's 43,000 cooperatives, 15,000 are located in this one region alone. So it's like it's a significant economic phenomenon. And what made it possible, or a significant thing that made it possible, was the role of the municipality. So what the municipality did was it worked in close cooperation, so helping the small enterprises to develop consortia and associations, and then working with them to help them define what their needs were in terms of research and development, training, financing, market support, infrastructure, the kinds of services that a multinational corporation would provide in-house. And so what happened in the case of Emilia-Romagna was that the municipality pioneered the role of the municipality as being in partnership not primarily with global capital, but with local capital and civil society. I'm just going to say that again because it feels to be a really significant part of what's emerging, is a growing, just another slightly different way in, that traditionally the role, or rather the training for a local economic development officer has been focused on how do you attract Microsoft or Amazon to come and locate their offices in your area. That's been the heart of the training of the local economic development officers. And increasingly, the municipality is seeing the vulnerability of doing this. Because first of all, you're losing a lot of income because you're needing to provide a lot of incentives. And secondly, when those incentives expire, there's nothing to stop the corporation simply relocating to somewhere else that could offer a sweeter deal. And because corporations work globally, it means that they're not really rooted in the local area. So it means that there's not, that when you then rip the factory out and put it somewhere else, there's not much left because they haven't really built the local supply chains because they're global. So increasingly, I think municipalities are going, interesting. Is there a different way that we could do this? That would actually, rather than allying with partnering with global capital to relocate their big factories in our area, that we go through the slower, more long-term process of building the interconnectivity and resilience within the local area. And they're really looking back to Emilia-Romagna as the first place that really did this. Okay, does this sound intriguing? Like, I mean, it's fascinating because, like, unlike so many other great ideas from the progressive left, it's not just an idea. It's somewhere you can actually go and visit and go, this is really fascinating. It's not perfect, but it's an example of a locality finding a way of building its economy through increased interconnectivity based on the culture and the resource base of the local area, which is the world we need to move into. Good. So let's, this is a long story, so there could be many stopping points. Let me just look to the more recent developments, which have been inspired. I mean, it's interesting that these more recent developments, they look to Mondragon and they say Mondragon is our inspiration. I think actually they're probably more influenced by Emilia-Romagna without really knowing about it. Let me just say a few words about Mondragon. Created by a priest. Can anybody pronounce his name?
Could you write the names of these?
Yeah. Jacob, do you want to scribe for me? Jacob's a former student who was a brilliant scribe.
I'm not sure I can spell Arias Mende.
Arias Mende was the guy, the priest. So there was a priest in this part of Spain. Any of you have seen Guernica, the famous Picasso painting of the destruction of Guernica? Franco hated the place. Center of resistance against fascism, a very poor part of Spain. So the war finished. It had been decimated by the war. The centralized government in Madrid was very hostile to any manifestation of Basque cultural expression, economically underdeveloped. What do you do? So this priest turns up and he's got this slogan. The slogan is savings or suitcases, meaning you either find a way of mutualizing your finances, pooling your resources and creating something together, or you're going to continue for the next decades watching your young people leave, pack their suitcases and leave. And again, the story of how Mondragon developed from just 2 or 3 cooperatives at the beginning into one of the biggest networks, probably the biggest network of cooperatives in the world. Again, far from perfect. There are many concessions that Mondragon has had to make to globalized capital because it's in competition directly against it. But nonetheless, very significant lessons to be learned. And I think the critical lesson to be learned is that if you want to break the gravitational pull of the globalized economy, you can't do it by creating a cooperative or by creating an ethically based organization, unless you identify the network of other organizations in your region with which you share value and with which you can go for savings, not suitcases, in which you can build a mutuality of mutual support within the network. So, fast forward, there's been a number of experiments in the meantime, but fast forward to the last decade where there's been a real proliferation of experimentation. And I'm going to mention 2 in particular. So one is, and I'd like just you to show me if you've heard of this place, please tell me with your body language, is the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland, Ohio. we have a local development planner from the United States with us. Here there was the priest in the Basque Country he's thinking, he's kind of applying systems thinking to how can we turn a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle? How can we find a way of mobilizing our resources for the common good? So a similar thing happened this is in Rust Belt. This is very poor, disadvantaged, marginalized part of the US. Deindustrialization, very high rates of everything from mental disease, incarceration, unemployment, the whole package. So what they do, and with the help of an outside organization called Democracy Collaborative, is they examine where is the money coming into this community. And they identify that the biggest chunk of money coming in is to do with the procurement budget. So the procurement budget means the money spent by local government on hospitals, on universities, on schools, on the whole range of public services. And so conventionally, the way that the procurement budget has been spent is that the people responsible will simply invite tenders for particular bits of work, and they'll give it to the lowest cost bidder, provided the core standards have been met. So in this area, what they did instead was they said, we're going to build the capacity of local enterprises, in fact, local worker cooperatives, to provide exactly those services. So the procurement budget has been, over the last decade, progressively transferred from actors outside of the area to actors inside the area, providing jobs and incomes for predominantly local, disadvantaged, marginalized people. And at the moment, they're providing, the key areas are food, laundry services, and energy. Those are the three core, but they're exploring, it's something they used to do in Damanhur regularly. Damanhur is an eco-village in Italy, probably the eco-village with the most intelligently designed economy. And at the end of every year, they would do a leaky bucket analysis. So they would see their economy, their local economy, as being like a bucket filled with holes. And asking the question, so noticing that money would come into the local economy, but as soon as it came in, it would immediately leak out because there was so little being provided locally. So their question every year was, what new leaks could we plug? What new activities could we do that we're not currently doing? And then providing this substantial financial muscle of the community in support to help community members set up enterprises to plug those gaps. So very similar both in Mondragon and also in the Cleveland cooperatives. So the idea is, it's still a very young initiative, so the jury is still out, but it's a really interesting experiment in recreating the translation of a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle, whereas more and more more goods and services are provided locally, so more and more money stays within the system, the tax base rises, the ability to fund new cooperatives increases, and a certain measure, I keep using this metaphor because I find it really powerful, of breaking the gravitational pull of the globalized economy. They begin to develop more economic muscle and more confidence. It's really interesting if you go online, go to YouTube and watch some of the videos about the evergreen cooperatives. It's almost like, more than anything else, these are people who have been at the bottom of the heap and really disempowered, who are going, we can do stuff. Very encouraging. So there's a town in the north of England called Preston. Again, very marginalised town, deindustrialised, kind of England's Rust Belt. And a couple of years ago, they were due to have had a major shopping centre locate itself in the middle of the town. I mean, kind of a crazy idea because it's one of the poorest parts of Britain. So, And the bankers eventually withdrew, sensibly. So it meant that their one economic project that might have generated jobs was gone. So again, an intelligent, forward thinker in the council who was aware of Mondragon, who was aware of the evergreen cooperatives, similarly looked at the procurement budget. And so this is called the Preston Model. Let me just give you some data on Preston. So it's looked at redirecting the £1.2 billion total annual spending power to local businesses. The key concept here is the idea of anchor institutions. So recognizing that that your anchor institutions are those who are committed to the place and they won't leave. So, you know, the university, the football team, the schools, the university, these won't leave, and they make substantial purchases of everything. In Preston, one of the things they did was they bought some land and engaged a farmer to grow the school meals for the local schools. So this is like a very simple little measure, but it's a way of generating local employment, building the self-confidence in the people that they can actually do stuff, and beginning to turn that cycle from the money wealth coming into the economy and immediately flushing out to beginning to plug some of the leaks so the money stays local. I'm just going to pause there for a minute. I've got tons more, but I'm just going to pause for a moment. Any reflections? Does this ring any bells? Any Danish experiment experience that echoes this? Does it seem like a good idea? Please.
How long have this been going on, these initiatives? How long have they been going on? Or do we know they're sustainable?
So Emilia-Romagna has been there since the war. So it's been many decades. Mondragon since 1956. So those are secure. The more recent ones are in the last decade or so. And these are very much works in progress.
Is there a line backwards in history to old times cooperatives? From the cases you mentioned, from the 50s or 60s?
Yeah.
Is there a line backwards or inspiration from, especially Southern Europe as well? The cooperative movement was much stronger.
There's a really interesting story there. I mean, I know the British co-op story better than Southern Europe. And there's a really curious, a very curious story around their development. So by the interwar period, the cooperative movement in Britain had, I think, the second biggest supermarket in Britain, supermarket chain. I need some water. I've got some. And it provided a lot of schooling, a lot of health services. You know, these cooperatives were critical to the health, the social health of the communities. And they'd grown up in the absence of any kind of state assistance. And then in the post-war settlement, where we had the birth of the welfare state and the National Health Service, and these were proclaimed and welcomed as making it a much more civilized society. And in a sense, of course, this was true. But the big losers were the cooperative. It was the cooperative and mutualist movement that previously had, and a more negative telling of that story is it moved from a system that was based on community solidarity to one that was focused on state provision. And I think that today, one of the journeys we need to make is actually to reverse that. Not that we want the state to contract, but rather to recognize the drawbacks of having health elder support, education services that are dependent on a universal standard state bureaucracy with very little place for citizens' engagement. Didn't answer the question, but it was a perspective. Please do.
We've heard of experiences in the UK, recent experiences, where you develop local money. How does that go into the picture you are drawing here? Is it existing, or is it of no value, or how do you regard this?
I would say it's not. I wouldn't say it's of no value, but I think that the experiments over the last couple of decades have been much less successful than had been hoped. I think there's a number of reasons for that. So again, the idea, the rationale being impeccable. So the rationale is to keep money flowing local, and if you're spending money that is generated by your own community, by definition, it can only be spent locally. So it looks like a great thing, which is why it's been such a popular type of intervention. It has, and in some cases, I mean, we can look at some cases. The term complementary currencies covers a wide range of different initiatives, and definitely there have been some success stories. But among the reasons why they haven't really been as effective as we had hoped are, one, most of them, and certainly all the transition currencies, you buy one unit with 1 unit of your own currency. So in other words, it's not really increasing the money supply, particularly for the poor, and it means that those who have the money can participate, but those who don't can't. So it's not increasing purchasing power among the most disadvantaged groups, is one. A second is that the people who go to the trouble of changing their money to get the new ones are the kind of people who would have bought locally already. So I was one of them. Like I would dutifully go and change my sterling for ecos, the Findhorn currency, and use my ecos in the shop. But in fact, I would have bought in the local shop anyway, even though it was more expensive. And a third is it's just so expensive, like the administration, the creation. So probably one of the most successful currencies in Britain has been the Bristol Pound. And it has been successful in that you can pay part of your business rates, part of your council tax, you can pay bus fees. There's various other things you can pay, which is really important. But it reaches a tiny fraction of the Bristol economy at an enormous cost in terms of the team that created it and the ongoing support to administer it. So maybe in the conversation we move into, we can look at different types of currency that I think have greater potential. But most of the currencies that the transition movement has flagged, I mean, Totnes, I live in Totnes, and I've never seen a Totnes pound being used.
It's closing down, I think, next week.
Is it next week?
Goodbye pound.
Oh, really? Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting that Rob Hopkins, I teach at Schumacher College, and Rob came in, and Rob is the founder of the transition movement, and he came in and he gave a presentation, and as usual, he said the Totnes pound. And I said, Rob, this is nonsense. I mean, it just is economically irrelevant. And he said, wrong. His answer was so fascinating. He said, wrong. It hasn't been significant economically, but the symbolism of simply holding up a beacon and saying, we are looking after our own economy. And like they produced a 21 pound note. Like, why would you produce a 21 pound note? And he says, because we can. And like I just noticed at that point, I looked at him and I said, I always thought you were a community development guy, but actually you're a guerrilla artist. And he said, yeah, exactly what I am. Just looking for things to do that contradict the norm, that upset the stories. So economically, the currencies are, I think, for the most part, are not particularly relevant. But later on, I want to talk about a couple that actually have done well. But they're not in Europe even, they're in Brazil. Okay. Any more for the moment?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm turning my back to you. I'm so sorry.
This one for the sake. So it seems that that the main thing in this is actually the network, to create the network of the support of local business supporting each other.
Yeah.
And isn't that also what is with those alternative currencies? If you do not have things you can buy, like I know when we were in Damanhur we talked, and as I say, well, the problem is we do not have enough production to actually get it to work totally.
So I remember when I was living in Findhorn, before we introduced the ECO, our own money currency, we had a LET system, local exchange trading system. And the shop in Findhorn was left with 20,000 credits. And it could buy lots of astro-shamanic healing, but it couldn't find carpenters and plumbers. And so I think, again, I think maybe a fourth reason is there's a misunderstanding about what is the nature of the problem. So I think those who are creating the currencies are assuming the problem is a lack of a means of exchange, when actually the bigger problem is the lack of diversity of skills. So if you've got a lot of masseurs and Reiki and astro-shamanic meditation, but you don't have carpenters and farmers in your system, I mean, you have to have them. I think this is the fourth reason, is kind of a misunderstanding of what is the core problem. So, so let me just cut forward to one of these currencies in Brazil that I think is probably one of the best in the world. And it's from a very poor area in the northeast of Brazil called Fortaleza. The area is called Fortaleza. The area is called Palma. And what they did, this is a community development initiative which, so most of the European examples of currencies have been people saying, we want to create a community currency. What's the problem we're trying to solve? So they begin by wanting to create a currency because they are so beautiful and iconic. Whereas that wasn't the way it happened in Brazil. In Brazil, they recognized the problem is very poor people, they don't have purchasing power, they don't have skills. So savings are suitcases. So what they did was they began by offering credit from Banco Palmas in the national currency for production and in Palmas, their own currency for consumption. And they did a lot of education of the local people. So it was effectively an NGO working in the community, helping people to see that as long as they're buying outside of the area, their young people will have to leave because there's no employment. So how can we simultaneously increase local purchasing, increase local productive capacity? And that process had been underway for quite a while. And then at a certain point they said, it would be interesting now to introduce a currency to further reinforce the trends that are already developing. And by way of interest, in the case of Palmas, the government of Brazil twice took them to court to legal cases against them for usurping their sole right to print currency. Twice the government lost, and on the basis of what they discovered in the trial, they invited the founder of the bank to recreate the bank model across Brazil. And there's now over 100 community banks across Brazil. So again, really interesting that the theme comes up again, that rather than being one single silver bullet solution, that there needs to be an ecosystem of mutually reinforcing interventions. And I think too often the currency, I mean, it's been so iconically beautiful that it's been irresistible to do without locating it within a wider ecosystem of interventions.
Just to build on your point, you're reminding me of your friend Ross Bernard,
The microphone.
Leotard. So Ross has a long-standing friend, some of you may know, Bernard Leotard, who recently died. But he emphasized that, you probably knew him, complementary currencies.
Sure.
That we should be thinking not about alternative currencies, but just like we have miles and points and, coupons and discounts from various sellers, that we should work with developing complementary currencies that serve purposes. And one of his favorite stories is of a low-income community is it in Brussels, where they had a lot of immigrants with very low purchasing capacity. And they surveyed these citizens and found that a large number of them most wanted access to land to have a garden. And the city had some land available. So they created a currency which these local impoverished poor citizens could purchase. They could get access. They could build up the currency by doing helpful volunteer work in the community to help their neighbors. And with the currency, they could rent, they could access garden plots. And he said it was very successful, not only in building community, and helping these people solve a problem of getting access to land, but that it encouraged volunteerism and it encouraged people to come together in community. It had all these positive benefits. So that suggested to me that you have to have some resources that people need, and these kinds of complementary currencies can be mechanisms for distribution and access that reward people, give them incentives to do socially cooperative behaviors. I wondered if you had thoughts about that.
Well, there are cases. It's really interesting. One of my students a couple of years ago picked this up as a research topic. Totally fascinating. Because on the one hand, there are examples of time banks, for example, where you earn credits in the form of time, for example, for doing pro-social behavior, where it clearly enables people who have fallen off the bottom rung of the ladder to get in. However, there's also lots of examples of where there are already strong communitarian, friendly, neighbourly initiatives happening, where you introduce an incentive like a reward, and it collapses. As soon as you remove the reward, it collapses. And her research was into, what are the key conditions? What are the key differences between these two? So I think with currencies, from my point of view, it was probably one of the most important areas that brought me into the whole field of new economics, because the educational value is enormous. Like the gulf between how we think money is created and how it's really created, it's a fabulous educational tool. But actually doing something about it in terms of creating new systems, difficult. But not impossible, and there are definite success stories. And we can maybe move into that in the discussion afterwards. I'm going to take about 10 minutes more just to wrap up. So I just want to step back, like why are we talking about municipalism, or why, I just want to step back and reflect on why is this so exciting me? Or why am I seeing it as a kind of a critical potential area for intervention that really can make a difference? And the reason is, I'm making this up as I go along, but the ideas that come to me at the moment are that if we don't do this, if we don't find a level of intervention where our authorities are consciously partnering with local small-scale capital and civil society, that economic democracy totally disappears. That we are at the mercy of decisions being taken in London, Washington, Copenhagen, wherever, in the great centres of venture capital. And so the aim is to, in terms of how we shape our communities, in terms of deciding what our priorities are and deciding the goods and services that we want our enterprises to produce, I think there's much more chance of that happening if we can find a way of creating mutually supported networks, value-based networks of producers and support organizations. So do I think that there's a magical scale at which all the problems with capitalism ceases to exist? No, of course not. But there is something about, there's something, first of all, about the ability of municipalities to break politically from the neoliberal agenda. So it is really striking as a European watching what happened immediately after the election of Trump, where the leaders and most of the mayors of the big cities in the States said, actually, we've got our own targets already, and Trump's election doesn't really change that much for us. And much more than at the national level, it is at the municipal level that we're seeing, from Curitiba in Brazil to Bogota in Colombia to Barcelona to Amsterdam. I mean, the list goes on, and it's a growing list of municipalities that, for example, are remunicipalizing, they're taking back under municipal control the utilities, the water, the electricity grids. So there was a period in the neoliberal period over the last 20 years or so where there was a strong trend towards privatization of these public utilities. In almost every case, the quality of the service dropped and the price increased. So there is a very strong impulse being driven by both municipalities and civil society to relocalize control and ownership of the utilities, which gives citizens the potential, as in there's a lot of German cities where this is happening, where the citizens are actually being invited to buy shares in their utility companies, and where the voice of the citizens is driving the process of rapid transition to renewable energy systems. There are a growing number of cases where municipalities are working with civil society to take organisations like Uber, Airbnb to court, as happened in London recently, and to actually where the legal process in a number of cases is the ruling against they're saying that, for example, Uber, you have Uber here, I'm sure.
No,
You-
don't have it anywhere.
Clever people, how did you manage that? Wonderful, God. You lucky people. So in most of the world there is Uber. And of course what happens is that when Uber gains a monopoly, on the one hand, its drivers become independent associates who have no rights. There was a Christmas Day 3-4 years ago in Britain. A delivery company went bankrupt on Christmas Day, 1,800 workers out of work, and it became clear within a week that 1,200 of them, 2/3, had zero redundancy, insurance, healthcare, anything. Because they'd been classified by the Uber lawyers as being, or not Uber in this case, but a similar company, as being associates rather than employees. And increasingly municipalities are on the one hand working with citizens groups to take organisations like Airbnb and Uber to court to make it really difficult for them to operate in their territories, and on the other to create cooperatively owned platforms. So one of the most famous in the States is in Austin, where the taxi service is dominated by a locally cooperatively owned platform rather than the global profit extractors. Maybe let me finish by saying that there is a place, like this is a place where, I mean, it's an artificial division, but we tend to carry it because we use different words for economics and democracy. I mean, actually at a community level, it's really important that we see these two as being part of the same equation. So we visited, where did we visit yesterday? Kalundborg. Where they're introducing, they're following the lead of a number of municipalities around the world in allocating a certain proportion of their municipal spend to local councils. When I say local councils, to popular assemblies who will decide their priorities for how the money will be spent. So this is something Jakob called participatory budgeting. That started in Porto Alegre in southern Brazil, but has gone global since, where citizens are given a share of the municipal budget to decide themselves how they want it to be spent. And what was really striking, I've done quite a lot of work in Brazil, in Porto Alegre. It was really striking when you listen to the people who were the initiators, is that they'd really set it out as a process for making sure that the municipal spend was in alignment with the wishes of local people, but they hadn't anticipated the democratic dividend, the degree to which the neighbourhood councils were meeting, and people who had been passive recipients of state services and passive consumers of goods and services produced by the system, to being engaged as decision makers at different levels at neighbourhood and then the district right up to the city level. So it seems to me that one of the that one of the key crises, and this comes as an eco-villager and someone who has lived in intentional self-governing communities for the last 25 years, is that my experience of participation at a meaningful scale in the decisions that affect my life are most untypical of the norm. Generally, and having lived for many years in Africa and feeling these are rich societies, like there's a poverty in our, I think in both societies there's a wealth and there's a poverty, but really feeling a level of engagement and participation in the governance of their communities that I really found totally lacking here. And engagement at the municipal level, particularly through processes like participatory budgeting, brings people back into developing those muscles of having an opinion, needing to work with others to make decisions, deciding how the money will be spent, taking ownership for the process, I think is a critical part of the journey. So that is the case for the municipality. Is it a magic bullet? It's not. But I think just to repeat what I said at the beginning, when I look at the nation state and the United Nations and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, I really don't see much hope that in the time available to us that we will be able to re-democratize those institutions. Village level is critical, but we're only as resilient as our most resilient, hungry neighbour. The municipality is a level at which there's real political muscle and real resources, and in which there's a growing record and experience of municipalities, progressive municipalities, entering consciously into partnership with civil society and local capital in a way that gives me more excitement than probably any other area of the new economics map. And I'm going to pause there.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you very much. So now we're open for questions and comments. Who would like to start off? Yes.
A question on the definition. When you say municipality, this word might mean different things in different countries, but my question will be, does it contain a certain process of citizens electing an authority to manage that level?
Interesting question. And actually, I would say that some of the more interesting experiments, and this is coming out of the Occupy movement and the Indignados in Spain, is a real dissatisfaction with representative democracy and a growing experimentation with direct democracy. So, like particularly in Barcelona, I think the Spanish experience has been particularly strong of how do we, so the dominant experience of participatory democracy being, I think for most of us, tell me if I'm wrong in the case of Denmark, certainly in the case of both Ireland and Britain, being, you're invited to turn up to vote once every 4 or 5 years, and you might, if you're part of the small minority, vote in the European election, the local election, but really that's the definition, or that's the extent of participation. And we're seeing, Brexit is one manifestation of a much wider disaffection with the participatory democratic model that we have. So that was a sideways, a tangential. To come back to the question, I would say the municipality is definitely one of its core definitions would be an area in which there are political organizations that are governed from within that area. But I noticed that among the most radical and exciting manifestations of the new municipalism is when they're looking beyond small enterprise support to re-enlivening democracy. Let me give just one very clear recent example, and this isn't quite, it's not at the municipal level, it's at a national level, but this is Ireland, which is so small, is that we have been a very divided society between, and very traditional conservative Catholic past and a more liberal green future. And this risked tearing the nation apart, particularly over demands that we amend the Constitution to legalize abortion and same-sex marriage. So what happened was that over a course of a year, one weekend a month for a year, 100 randomly picked set of citizens were invited to come together in a People's Assembly and to spend a year respectfully listening to each other and calling experts and then coming up with a series of recommendations to the Parliament, which resulted in astonishingly large majorities for abortion and same-sex marriage. But it was a process that pulled the citizens in as active, responsible, courteous, polite, mutual listeners rather than, and the contrast between that experience and what happens in the national parliaments was shaming for the politicians. So I think I'm really excited by experiments in revitalizing democracy. That was a bit of a long-winded answer, apologies.
So I have a little question for you, Jonathan. I think with your background in Africa, could you say something about what trends that may be going on there in this area? Do we see any similar ideas of people in municipalities taking initiatives like the sort of things we described in Italy and Spain?
Unfortunately, in Africa, very little. Africa is so much a victim from the colonial experience. So the great, I lived in Ghana for 4 years, and Ghana is dependent totally on cocoa and coffee and just really a couple of commodities. So they're hyper non-resilient. So in Latin America, I can think of quite a few examples of really imaginative municipal activity. Maybe I can give one example. It's not answering the question about Africa. So I mentioned previously the southern Brazilian city of Curitiba. And I just wanted to explain the process. This is also an old one. This goes back probably 25, 30 years. But it speaks from a systems perspective to the question of complementary currencies and the value of complementary currencies. So in this city of Curitiba, it was among the poorest in Brazil. Today it's one of the richest, but then it was among the poorest. They had a pretty good light railway system, but as in anybody been to Brazil, Latin America, in Brazil, 85% of the population lives in Swaziland and 15% lives in Switzerland. It's the most astonishing diversity in physical conditions. So the poor, as in Curitiba, live on the outskirts, on the steep hillsides, and the rich live in the middle. And the poor come in every day, army of cleaners and childminders and chauffeurs. But they were finding that the hillsides were so steep that the garbage trucks couldn't get up into the favelas, into the poor areas. And so there were occasional outbreaks of cholera, major disease, health problems, and the municipality didn't have any money. So what they did was they tried to link up where is our spare capacity and where is our unmet need, and is there a way that we can. So I mean, again, I just want to pull back on that one. If you think of, I mean, have you got any poor towns in Denmark? Do you have any poverty in Denmark?
Not as much as most places.
So, like any of you who've been to Britain or the States, like classic neoliberal economies, will know that there are many cities where there is so much work that needs to be done, and there's so many young people who are unemployed, but there isn't a mechanism to actually pull these two together, the unmet need and the spare capacity. So this is very much the case in Curitiba. So what the mayor did was he invited people in the favelas to bring their rubbish down to the bottom of the hill where the garbage trucks could get them, and he paid them in bus tickets or train tickets so they could move to the city. So what happened was that the garbage came down the hillsides, small enterprises employing local people were created to separate the waste streams that were coming down. So there was one compost making business, there was another toy making business from broken toys, a range of different enterprises. There were gardens that were started using the compost that had been created in one of the waste streams, and a whole ecosystem of enterprises emerged. So then some people, the people bringing down the garbage, could be paid in bus tickets or food or toys or the various other services being offered. And so you had a case where now, this was an important part of Curitiba moving from being among the poorest parts of Brazil to being among the richest communities, without using a complementary currency but performing the same role as a currency would be expected to do. So this is intelligent joined up systems thinking. So rather than being fixated on the form of the complementary currency, it's thinking, what are the systems that are malfunctioning? And again, my experience is that it is at the municipal level that much more so than at the national level that these ideas can be put into practice.
Very interesting case, yeah. Okay.
Are there any pioneering municipalities in Denmark? Like any pioneering municipalities here? Are they all pioneering?
Oh yes, there are some. But Niels, you could talk about that. About pioneering municipalities in Denmark. For example, Sønderborg.
Well, we have different kinds, because internationally, municipalities have organized themselves in different concepts. With some of them, we focus on the smart cities and technologies, but others more basically on bottom-up approaches. But for example, Sønderborg is a part of a UNESCO initiative about learning cities. And they are really now a prominent city also in the European scale and also internationally, and have many initiatives around organizing communities. But it's in the periphery of Denmark, and that gives some opportunities also to raise up, because there's so much capital and interest in the local area. And they have a focus on building sustainability for the youth, for example. They have a lot of initiatives around how they can engage people from the countryside. And in that way, they try to build up really a community that can be part of some regional organizing also. So they are waiting also for other initiatives so they can connect to them, so they can be a part of a more holistic approach on a regional level. Because they know that at the municipality level it's not enough. They have to broaden it out and build some kind of resilience. But it's in a process, and there's a dialogue about it.
Yeah. Good.
I can give an example of participative budgeting in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, because I worked at the research institute in the Netherlands for 2 years called Drift. And we did a project for the municipality of Rotterdam, who wanted to engage their citizens more with the budgeting, or with mostly with the how to how do you say that in English? The public streets, what was going on in the streets, basically, how to organize that. But during the project, I was working on it, and we held sessions on site in the neighborhood, and it was also a bit of a more poorer neighborhood. We noticed that you get this problem that mostly the white educated people came, and there's a lot of immigrants living in Rotterdam, and they speak Dutch, and they're sort of integrated, but still to this project we only in the end the white men came that were really interested in the techniques of these things. And we tried like going out on the street, getting more people, but this was really a problem for the participative budgeting, because we ended up doing some test projects and they were quite successful. They got a zebra path along the street where they really wanted it, and some other changes, but they weren't supported by the whole community because we didn't manage to engage the whole community. Yeah.
So the interesting thing is in Porto Alegre it was the opposite. In Porto Alegre it was the poorest who were most involved.
Yeah.
And you know, I think this is a really important area of research. And one of my students this year is on this for his dissertation. Is what are the, like, recognizing the transition, for example, is very white and middle class, and he is fascinated by this. And the question he's working with are, what are the images and the motifs and the stories that will better link up with that, because clearly the transition stories, I say, in Europe, the transition story is a very white organization. So what are the, you know, looking beyond the label to ask what are the mythologies and stories and images that will resonate with other than white middle class people. And I think it's a really exciting research topic. Thank you. I spent, I was working with the Chaos Pilots in Aarhus in September. And I got the impression that it felt very, very different from being in Britain or Ireland. I mean, it felt thoroughly, sensibly social democratic. Like it felt like your municipality, maybe I'm seeing some hands shaking, but I mean, definitely the local library, for example, that the municipality had built. Does anybody know the library in Aarhus? I mean, it's astonishing. It's like a palace of culture. Like in Britain, our libraries are in little back sheds. Or closed, or the citizens have needed to re-democratize the process to take control. And I kind of wonder whether this presentation, these ideas might be more relevant for an Anglo-Saxon neoliberal culture where the citizens need to take back power because our governments have stopped looking after us in a way that I get the impression here that the state still has not totally abandoned you.
So I have another little question for you about some existing organizations. For example, in the United States, we have the Pioneers and we have the Bala Group, who are thinking along very similar lines. Would you have comments as to what you think about the way they're tackling it as opposed to the municipalism? Are you familiar with those two organizations?
Sure,
yeah.
Sure. It's interesting that in the US there's been quite a lot of recent thought given to bringing movements together, like really asking the question, what do we have in common? And one thinker in particular, Gar Alperovitz.
Gar Alperovitz.
I'm
a bad marker. Thank you.
It's really a whiteboard marker for that one.
So I would say that the political platform that I have presented this evening, I think would be broadly shared.
Would be?
Broadly shared. Like
yeah.
I don't think I've said anything that the people in Bali, the Business Alliance for Living Local Economies, Democracy Collaborative, there's a number of different networks and organizations, and I'm not sure that we're representatives of those organizations here tonight. I'm not sure I said anything that they would disagree with.
No, in fact, they would find it enlightening. They would find it useful in putting things together.
Yeah. There's one there's one theoretical framework or way of organizing I haven't mentioned so far that could just be useful to bring in, which is bioregionalism. Kind of checking for body language, bioregionalism.
You say it once more.
Bioregionalism. Regional. Bioregionalism. So the idea being that the massive energy dividend that we have got from fossil fuels has enabled us to ignore natural design patterns and simply replace the meandering shapes of nature with straight lines. And this is really represented in our political boundaries. So, I mean, not least having worked in Africa, where in 1886 a group of men, none of whom had ever been to Africa, created the states. And apparently only 6 of the lines do not bisect a nation. Or we call them derisively tribes or nations. Only 6 of the lines in Africa do not bisect a nation. So no relationship whatsoever generally between our political boundaries and our biological boundaries, or bioregional people often talk in terms of watersheds. So like what would be a region that would have biological, ecological coherence? A really interesting experiment happened early where there was an attempt by ecologists to map North America in terms of bioregions, regions that had a coherence ecologically. And then someone had the idea of transposing on top of that map the map of pre-Columban indigenous peoples. And they found a near total coincidence. In other words, and I find this very poetically beautiful actually, that in the absence of fossil fuels, that the human community the patterns of settlement of human communities will match those of ecological communities. In other words, we belong to the earth and we are woven into the cultures of the places that we belong to. And we're moving into a period where we will need to rediscover that we will not have the fossil fuels and the power to be able to ignore natural patterns. So could it be that the next step on from the municipality is actually the bioregion, where we're looking at governance in human systems that are much more deeply and explicitly rooted in the ecological foundations on which all life is based?
That reminds me a little bit about this idea that was been talked a lot about back in the 70s, the Europe of the regions.
Yeah, I know. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. They have a very similar concept.
Indeed.
Yes, I think there were about a couple of hundred, and they were very natural areas, culturally speaking,
Indeed.
even more than bioregional.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was before the European Union got captured by the neoliberal machine.
Yeah. So maybe we'll go back to that at some point. If we have a major collapse, it'll be a very natural thing for these groups to reorganize.
I was at a gathering in the European Commission, and we were looking at a green label for Europe, and there was one of the commissioners who was arguing vehemently for the single market, and I said that we in the British and in the English and Welsh Green Party had really struggled because they had omitted any mention of the word local in their criteria. And I mean, he was angry. He was like, this has nothing to do with local, this is the global market, or the single market. And so I said to him, so if you produce a product in eastern Poland that meets all of the criteria and then you ship it to the west of Ireland, that's a green label. And he said, absolutely. So this is it's a measure of the divorce between economics thinking and ecological logic.
That, if nobody, yes, here's a question.
Would this be a good moment to mention the events coming up and some of you.
Some of you are familiar with Ross's foundation. I think I'm just going to project. Okay, Gaia Trust, and the foundation has supported a Öresund region network and project to explore how we might move back into our historic regional economies, and recognizing that resilience cannot be managed just at the local town level, that we need to have essentials of food, water, energy, waste management. All of these services require a larger area than any one town can take care of alone. And we have many governmental agencies that operate in larger regional scales, hospital, education districts. There's many, water management, forest management. And so this idea of, as Jonathan was saying, grouping towns, looking at the historic bioregions or local areas, has been a very useful model. In the US, we've had a number of these local regions emerge as resilience regions. And so starting this past fall, Gaia Trust has funded this work for a couple of years to see if we can network together. And there are several key themes that people are already working on. Some of you may know Mads Wolf, who used to work for the mayor of Copenhagen, and he has a vision that's similar to Jakob, and thinking about the regional food system and how we can strengthen the resilience and increase the amount of local food that people consume. Others have been interested in microgrids with decentralized generation of power, renewable energy, 100% truly renewable, not wood burning, which is worse than coal, not natural gas, which is worse than coal. The numbers are showing that we've made mistakes in pursuing those two energy sources, but instead 100% wind, water, and solar, which can power the world. There's very interesting work that documents this. I'll put a website for you here of Stanford research called the Solutions Project that describes how we can power our world with renewable energy. So how can we as communities and as a region have microgrids that are 100% renewable with more local storage and be able to provide more of our local region needs in case of, well, as these hurricanes, ice storms, and other major weather disruptions happen more and more. Even under the best case scenario, we know that we're going to need more local resilience for energy, and rather than leaving it to future generations to begin developing those systems now. So as part of this inquiry of how to strengthen the local region, Jonathan's going to be a part of a conversation on Saturday here from 1 until 4 o'clock. And if you'd like to mention the other representatives who are going to be coming.
Yes, I'd like to mention that you're all very welcome if you'd like to take part. We've invited some economists besides Jonathan, Kristen Sørensen, who is the former chair of the Economic Council. Vismændene here in Denmark will be there. Katarina Jusilius, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Copenhagen, will be coming, and the chair of the Danish Entrepreneur Society and others. So we'll have an introduction by some of the guest speakers, and followed by dialogue and some open space work on subjects which people would like to talk about. And the whole idea is simply to get the activists in this region networking together and try, and hopefully some projects will emerge that people want to work together on. And we've already seen some very positive results from our first gathering a month ago. So 1 o'clock this Saturday, you're all welcome, and I hope I'll see some of you there. I know some of you who are here are coming already, so I hope we'll have a few more. So we still have a few minutes left if anyone else would like to put some questions to Jonathan. If not, we can perhaps round off a bit early. Yes.
address this, but I wonder what your opinions or thoughts are about concentration of wealth and power, whether you think it is becoming a more significant problem for economies and for governmental oversight of economies, that we're seeing global collaboration to steer our government policies in similar directions. The US, Brexit, the leaning right in Denmark, Sweden, France, now Spain. What you believe is happening, what you think the effects are on economics and economic policy? That's a very broad question.
So at Davos, they're really sweating over this. I mean, honestly, they really are. They're every year there's the World Economic Council, and every year they project their key risks, and inequality has just shot up. Now for them, the risks are that we stop buying stuff, one, and two, that the poor might start eating the rich. In other words, that there will be effectively a revolution. So they're really worried. And again, can I ask another scribe to put the great David Graeber up on the board? So this is perhaps the best, sometimes the funniest book that I've read in many years. It's called Debt, The First 5,000 Years, by David Graeber, and who's an American anthropologist, where he describes the inexorable process of civilizations whose money is based on debt towards ever greater gap between the rich and the poor, until the poor start eating the rich, until the blood starts flowing. And there is no sign that our political leaders at the moment have got that. And so, although having said that, something that I don't, do you know this Oxfam figure that the richest 8 people in the world have more wealth than the bottom 50% of humanity? I really don't use these numbers like this because much of the wealth is totally fictitious. So most of the wealth is based on asset bubbles, and when they pop. So for example, just to give one good example of an asset bubble, is that our stock market valuation is dependent on the assumption that the declared fossil fuel assets will be realized, will be exploited. But we know that if we're to have any chance of staying within Paris COP levels of greenhouse gases and temperature increase, that at least 80% of declared fossil fuel assets must stay on the ground. So either civilization breakdown through climate change, or the asset bubble pops and much of the fictional wealth of the rich simply disappears. So will we find the intelligence, or will the rich find the intelligence to gracefully, what David Graeber recommends we should do, what should we do, David? He said, it's easy, you simply shift the decimal point one place to the left. You just wipe out 90% of all debt. And which is what we did, like in the, are you aware of the Jubilee campaign, the debt forgiveness campaign for Africa? And this is what previous societies whose money system is based on debt did, was they recognized that when a new ruler came to town, when a new ruler inherited the throne, they simply wiped off previous debt, because if they didn't, the process of impoverishment of the poor meant that much of the population became slaves, and they would flee into the forest, and occasionally they would descend on the city and burn it to the ground and eat the rich. I want to give just one final answer to the Africa question. So I said before I couldn't think of anything positive in Africa. In fact, it's come to me, is that as a result of the Emilia-Romagna experience, this is the enterprise clusters, UNIDA, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, created a program called its SME Cluster Development Program, where it tried to take I used to work for them in Africa, where we tried to take the ideas learned in the Italian clusters and transfer them to an African context. So I did my own master's research thesis in an industrial shanty town of 40,000 informal artisanal metal workers and car mechanics. And the challenge there that we were working with using the UNIDO model was to promote cooperation within the cluster. So instead of competing against each other in a race to the bottom, they were actually improving cooperatively their technology and skills so as to be able to earn contracts, to win contracts that they could not have earned before as working as individuals. And I found in my 15 years of working in Africa, these were probably the most successful projects I worked in at low cost. However, the problem was, and this is really the reason why I stopped working in Africa, is that the capacity of the clusters was increased in order to further immerse them into the globalized economy, rather than to build mutual resilience. And it seems to me that the only direction of travel at the moment that makes any sense is to move away from dependence on the globalized economy into building interconnectivity and resilience within our systems.